Yassine is about to become a father. His wife is on the verge of, well, we didn't know. So I'm his backup, I'm his stunt double. Give him a hand when he just jumps up, because he's going to take over for me in a bit. So I'll start. I'm Joran, by the way. Thank you, Yassine. See you in a bit. Oh, wait until he's a father for the second time. So he already has some experience. Okay. It's kind of a big screen. It's intimidating, so let's go to this slide because it's a bit more friendly. So we're from Jumbo, right? And we have a bit of the touch point that the previous presentation also gave. So I hope to inspire you with our talk, because we're going to talk about how we built our front-end platform. Now, for some background information, for those of you who don't know who Jumbo is, a short introduction we already had. So we're a family-owned business. We've been at it for over 100 years, but we started with one general goods store, and that exploded to over 700 brick and mortar stores in the Netherlands and a couple in Belgium. So again, local is also a deal for us. Great. So on top of the brick and mortar stores, we also offer e-commerce, and we started doing that. Let's do some history lesson, because I'm going to talk about e-commerce, and the e-commerce, that's going to be the canvas on which we're going to paint our front-end platform on. So bear with me. E-commerce. So 8 or 9 years ago, we started with what we call the Jumbo Tech Campus, the JTC, and it was basically 1 or 2 Scrum teams working on e-commerce, right? So a small team. But they were tasked with doing the e-commerce for over 700 stores. So what they did at the time, something that made sense, they grabbed an off-the-shelf solution, e-commerce solution, and started implementing that. And that worked great. So they had the thing doing everything, was a giant monolith. And if you look at it right now, it seems like maybe we could have something better. But back in the day, that just made sense, right? That's how you kickstart your business. So cool. Now this monolith was doing everything. It was doing the checkout, it was doing the registration, it was serving pages, it was like the whole shebang. Now, if we fast forward a couple of years later, so we're talking now 7 years ago, I think, the JTC started to grow. So now we have more teams working on that same code base, often with the same goals, but not in the same team. So we were having friction between teams. We were experiencing some friction, and that was because maybe a team needed to wait for a release of the other team, or there was just a release cycle that was holding a team up. And that was becoming an issue for us. And if something becomes an issue, well, Daniel talked about the dev experience. I think that's really important to take that into account. So we decided to see what we can change. And what we did is we started to take that monolith and, well, we call it peeling the onion without crying. That's really important. So this is this big onion, right? It does everything for us. And what we did to begin with is to make that onion smaller. And that's great. And what we did as a first step is to add a CMS next to it. And that CMS, that was tasked with serving pages. And it enabled our content editors to do the stuff they like as a team. So they're independent of us, and they can work on content. They can just type whatever they want and insert it. They're not dependent on us anymore. So that's already a big win for them, and also for us. What we also did is we started to add some Vue components to the client side. And why we did that? Again, to offload a bit of the responsibility from the e-commerce engine, in this case to the client side. And what is also important to mention is by this time we were doing this in a component library, because that way you can reuse it. So we have this picture right now, well, 7 years ago. So what's happening is, I have to take a look at my notes. Yeah, well, we started to grow again, and we had these teams. In these teams, we were having ownership over their code, so teams could make their own decisions. And we were already invested in Vue, and what one team did is they started to create Nuxt, or use Nuxt to do their job for them. And that team was in full control over the checkout in this case. And as you can imagine, for e-commerce, a checkout is kind of a big deal. It's an important thing. But it worked. Due to having a component library where you can easily scaffold out applications, you get the idea. Another team followed suit, because they were looking at the e-commerce or the checkout guys, and they were seeing, hey, this works, so why not do it? Cool. And if, well, it's a Dutch saying, I think, but if everybody started to follow. So we started to see all of these teams doing their applications in Nuxt. And this was great, because this was exactly what we wanted. We wanted to make the e-commerce engine smaller, and put the responsibility, or just extract the responsibility and put that in the teams, because the teams then are able to make their own decisions, and that's awesome, right? Yeah, so this is what it looked like. As a consumer of Jumbo, you would hit the CDN, and based on the route, you would get either redirected to one of the Nuxt applications, so ABCDE. We did call them differently in the repository, but you get the idea. So, or you could get served by the CMS, which did it served the pages, so fine. And there was still the e-commerce engine, and that was still doing its job, so no big deal there. So this is what it looks like. That's great, right? We have teams now being in control of their domain. That's awesome. We are not dependent anymore on those release cycles of the e-commerce engine, because that's now isolated to its own part. And everybody was happy. Well, not exactly, because what we saw with having that component library and all of these teams, all of these teams were making contributions to the component library, as you can imagine. So somebody was updating a component. And what we value is a omni-channel experience. Basically, for us, that means that whether you hit any of the Nuxt instances, or the CMS, or the e-commerce, or even visit the brick-and-mortar store, the branding should be as identical as possible. But if somebody updates a component, then everybody should update, right? And if you have all of these teams having to update, then everybody's doing updates instead of working. So that was not really something that we liked. And again, if it is something that you don't like, you start to change it, or you see you're going to find ways to change it. And that's what we did. So, and this is actually where the front-end platform was conceived, so to speak, to stay in the terms of becoming a father for the second time. No, we thought we can do better than this, right? We have a list, and we know what we like. We know what we don't like, and there's stuff we want to keep in. And to iterate over that grocery list, why not? At the top of it was to reduce the maintenance and the chores we were experiencing, because that really got in the way of us doing our job. We had a couple of other things on that list, like we wanted to keep the content editors be in control of their content, because they were really happy. A part of our job is to keep people happy, so if you do that, then please keep doing that. And we would also like to have the teams still have to retain their ownership of the content that they have, of their own domain. So that was really important. And we assumed that if we do all of that, then we have some more time to work on the cool stuff. So with that, we got to work.
Click. Yeah, thanks. Now that the requirements were clear, we thought, let's see if there is, what kind of solutions do we have? So what options do we have? So the very first option was, can we solve this with Nuxt, since we do have experience with Nuxt? But the question was actually more or less, can we solve this with the classic Nuxt instance, where you have one Nuxt instance with multiple pages? That was a no-go for us, and that comes back pretty much to the fact that we didn't like the friction between the teams, and we don't want to keep the ownership of the teams, of their own domain within the teams. So that was a no-go for us. The other option could have been, can't we take like an off-the-shelf solution, like a SaaS solution that solves this issue? That could potentially be an option, but if you take such solution, you still have to integrate with it, if that makes any sense. So we do have our component library where we have our components, and in order to allow those on such a CMS environment, as example, we have to integrate with such system. And we are stubborn in a way, so we were like, we're taking the challenge. So we took the challenge, and we created our front-end platform based on an X amount of, so this platform consists of 4 subsystems, and we will go through them one by one. Okay, the very first one being the component library. Joran mentioned it quickly, like we do have a component library where all the components go, which is part of our design system. This library is built in Vue. It's something that we've been working on for quite some time. So it's something that we do trust It's there for quite some time, so our developers are known with it. Our designers are very familiar with it. It has like the whole unit testing thingy, visual test, storybook. By the way, I'm very inspired today, so we might jump on Histoire. So, who knows? So that's that. So the thing was already there. We were improving it and improving it, and that was something that we would like to have like one of the fundamental things in our system. The only agreement that we introduced here is that no matter what you're working on, if it's a component, whether it's small, big, dumb, or very or small, big, dumb, or dumb, smart, big, or small, it should go there, which means everything goes there. First of all, to create transparency between teams, so you can see as a developer and as a member of any kind of team what's already there, but also to allow our content editors to grab everything that's already built by developers. So that's that. That's the very first system, the component library with a very small agreement that we added to it. And then comes the CMS. So Joran mentioned it already. We do have a CMS. We did have CMS. We still have it. But that CMS is set up in such a way that it also does the rendering for us. We have an awesome component library with a lot of components, but those components are rendered in the client. So we had to do something about it. But besides that, it's a pretty good one. And if you recognize the icon, we use AAM. In this case, it doesn't really matter. I think we get back to that. The fact that CMS doesn't really matter in this whole front-end platform thing. The user experience of the editor is awesome. So our content editors are used to it. And they know it. They're familiar with it. There is already some content there. So that was a no-brainer for us. So we went with it. What we had to do is we wanted to set this thing as a headless CMS and consume it as a headless CMS. So we had to adjust here and there a few things, and we had to build an adapter to transform the data to a data model. I think I'll get that on the next slide, but we had some minor adjustments. That's the second subsystem. And then the third one, which is pretty much the brain of this whole thing. This is where the magic happens. This system is the layer that receives the data from our CMS. But we do have an agreement on how the schema should look. So we have a data model, and we expect the data to look like this and that. That's how a page structure should look like. And inside a certain page, there are certain components, and components look like this. So in this case, it doesn't really matter what CMS you're using, as long as you write an adapter, which we did, and meet the criteria, you can hook it to every and each CMS. So this layer does receive the data, it validates whether the data is fine, it puts it in the database, it checks, as I mentioned, it does some validation, and it also does routing. So you can check whether a certain page is there, you get a page, if the page is in there, you get, as example, a 404, or with the structure of a 404, by the way. So this is the place where pretty much everything was glued together. And then there is the last layer, and that is the renderer. Since we are using Vue in our component library, our render engine is Nuxt. So we use Nuxt for rendering the content that comes from the content service. What we have as a benefit is that we have created this schema of how the content should look like and how the page structure is built, as in how the components also look, how the properties are organized, which then allows us to give that information to Nuxt to render the page. Okay, simplified. As a user, as a content editor, you start in AAM as a CMS. You publish a page, as example. That page gets transformed via our adapter that's specifically built for this very specific CMS. That's then sent to the content service, which then checks if the data is fine, Is it what we agreed on? Okay, cool. Then let's put it in the database. If the data isn't fine, we will tell you, and we'll let CMS know what you've sent us is garbage. Okay? Which also allow us to do things like WordPress if we really want to, but also Storyblock or Contentful as example. You can even run them in parallel if you really want to. So what it really means is it's not really hooked to a CMS. It's more like a complete platform, and in this case, a CMS is just a tool. So that's from data perspective. From user perspective, as a user, you request a certain page, and the very first layer you hit is Nuxt. Nuxt extracts the URL that you want to visit and goes to the content service. The content service checks whether that page does exist. If it does, from the database, you get that data sent back. If the page doesn't exist, as example, you're requesting a foobar page which doesn't exist, then you get a 404, but then with the structure of a 404 page, which is obviously a page that also lives in the content service. Believe it or not, it pretty much worked. But we had some tiny challenges. I'll just name a few for the sake of time. Two of these challenges, one of which is the component library we have. So we have tons of components in our component library, and gluing these components with the editor environment in the CMS can be a hustle if you do them one, by hand especially. Especially if you want to move from one CMS to another, you have to create that glue layer still by hand. What we came up with is some metafiles we put next to the components themselves. First of all, to describe what a component does, which can be very helpful for a content editor, but also to tell how to interact with certain components. It describes the components and how the props are related to each other. You can imagine if you have like a button, and a button can whether be primary or secondary. There are two properties, example. But if you create such a glue layer, you can tell, okay, these two are in a relationship, as example. So that's that. And that then allows us to generate this glue layer, no matter what CMS you're interacting with. The other classic mistake we had is that we were shipping everything to the user. The whole component library was sent. And that's because we didn't really know what the page was looking like. So we didn't really know what components were used on that page. The solution to that was actually rather simple. If you use Nuxt, then you most probably use the Nuxt component module, which is already baked in. What we did there is that we showed the component module where our components are, and once we bundle the thing, it separates the components by file, so it also allows you to do lazy loading. And when the page is loaded, only the components that are shown on that page, because it's a dynamic page, obviously, where the content structure is in the content service, once the page is loaded, only the components that are on the page are already are loaded. And that pretty much solves the issue. As I mentioned, there are a lot of other issues, but I wanted to sum up two of them. This time it worked, and fun fact, it's already running in production, and I would like to take the stage to thank the guys that already worked on this. Shout out to you all. And let me summarize it for you. So we started with one big monolith application, which did the job. We discovered that if we would like to give the teams more ownership, and to make them more autonomous, that it would make sense to let them do the things themselves. And that led us to this micro apps structure we ended up having, which was also awesome. And then we moved toward this front-end platform situation, where we bring everything together without sacrificing the ownership of the teams, but also bringing us and allowing us to give the end user a better omni-channel experience by having one application to deal with. From a developer perspective, this adds a lot of value, because now, as developers, we can focus on what matters most, and that's adding value. As example, writing components in the component library that can help the user, that can help the business, I should say. But from a user perspective, it's also beneficial because we have one UI that the user interacts with, rather than multiple instances that can potentially look different because some applications aren't up to date, some are using like local components in their Nuxt instances. So that was that. From content editor perspective, now we have a platform where everything that is ever built by a developer is already available there. So they can now spin up pages like 10 times faster than they used to, which was like a huge win. With that, I think we have come to the end of this talk. So I'd like to thank you all for your time. You've been an amazing crowd. If you have questions, we'll be here, of course, after the talk, but we'll be there tomorrow as well. Please come talk to us. I promise you we'll be kind. I know that Joran doesn't bite, so that's a good thing. So yeah, once again, thank you all. Have a nice evening. Take care.